While we may be failing to decrease poverty, aren't we at least doing a better job than we ever have in human history? Are we doing a failing but better job on poverty, just like we are doing a failing and better job on racism and sexism? Because those are arguments we always hear from those who are too often apologists for ongoing racism and sexism. And I'm wondering
Yeah.
if those same people could make similar statements about poverty and the unfairness of our global economic system.
So the narrative about poverty is a really interesting one, and so too about inequality. We can get to that a little bit later. But the dominant narrative here is that the Millennium Development Goals under the UN over the past 15 or 17, 18 years has been incredibly successful at reducing poverty around the world. And we're told now that with Sustainable Development Goals, we'll eradicate poverty, hopefully, by 2030. And this is a very compelling story. It's a wonderful bit of good news in a world full of bad news. It gives us hope and makes us feel like we're on the right track. But unfortunately, it's a story that's been used basically to justify the status quo of the global economy. So the idea is that, sure, inequality might be getting worse in nations like the U.S., et cetera, but basically the system of neoliberal corporate globalization is delivering gains against poverty in poor nations, and so it should be celebrated. We should keep on with the existing plan. Now that might be a worthwhile argument. If it weren't for the fact that it's based on pretty shoddy data. Now, the thing here is that the narrative of poverty being reduced relies on a poverty line of only $1.25 a day. Okay, this is the standard international poverty line, and according to this, it's saying that poverty is diminishing around the world, down to about 1 billion people. Now, what's interesting here is that the vast majority of those gains, virtually all of those gains, in fact, have come from one place, and that's from China. Okay, so, and the reason that's important is because China has basically not followed the strategy of neoliberal globalization that the rest of the world has been forced to follow under pressure from the U.S., the World Bank, and the IMF, and so on. So it doesn't really make sense to include China's gains against poverty in this broader story of U.S.-led free market economies are winning the game for everybody. So if you take China out of the equation, then we see that there's been virtually no gain against poverty since at least the 1980s. We have roughly the same number of people in extreme poverty today as we did back then. So that's quite disturbing. But the bigger issue here also is that the $1.25 a day line that the UN uses and the World Bank uses is not considered to be accurate by scholars of poverty. So if you look at the consensus among academics, the poverty line should actually be closer to about $5 per day as a minimum necessary for people to achieve basic normal human life expectancy, reasonable standards of nutrition, of maternal mortality, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens if we measure poverty at the $5 a day line? What we see is that it has been increasing dramatically since the 1980s and is today at about 4.3 billion people, which is 60% of the human population. And with these kinds of numbers on the table, then it's very clear that not only is the situation not getting better, but also it's evident that the global economic system is simply not serving the majority of humanity. And so what we need here is to think beyond just tweaking the system a little bit with some aid here and there, and think about how to fundamentally restructure it so that it delivers a fair share of our world's resources to the people that need it most.
Can we just do globally whatever it is China is doing to end poverty and inequality?
So yeah, China's an interesting example here. So they've basically exercised state control over a lot of their market policy. Now they have, of course, integrated into the world economy, but they've done so on their own terms. Okay, so now this was something that was denied to the majority of the world's poorer nations during the 1980s and 1990s. What happened basically, and you can talk about this more at length if you like, but what happened basically is that after the third world debt crisis of 1980, then the IMF imposed what we call structural adjustment programs across global South nations. And what they did was they reversed policies of protectionism and nationalization and social spending in favor of getting rid of tariffs, privatizing public assets, cutting social spending and using that as debt repayment, et cetera, getting rid of capital controls, allowing multinational corporations more freedom to operate in these nations, and so on. And what that did effectively was it dramatically cut the ability of these poor nations to grow their own per capita incomes, okay, and reduce poverty on their own terms. And so during the 1980s and 1990s, under these structural adjustment programs, it was a complete disaster in terms of development for the global South. And today they're only just beginning to catch up to their 1980s levels, basically. So unfortunately, those are lost decades to us now. Ideally, nations would have been able to follow the China model during those decades, but they were debarred from doing so because it was against the U.S.'s interest to allow them to do so, as it would have denied the U.S. access to their markets and to cheap raw materials from those nations.
So did we create a system through the IMF structural adjustment program to make developing nations permanently indebted to us?
So the way it worked was that the debts actually began to accumulate in the 1970s before structural adjustment. So effectively what you had here was you had a surplus of capital being accumulated in the U.S., and banks were looking for ways to invest that surplus capital. But they couldn't find any place to invest it in the U.S., basically because the U.S. was going through a period of stagnation in the 70s. So what they did instead is they invested all of their excess capital abroad in the form of loans to developing country governments. And of course, they were glad to take those loans. But then what happened in 1980 was that Paul Volcker, the chair of the Federal Reserve, increased interest rates in the U.S. Pretty dramatically, up to about 20%. And because these Global South loans were denominated in U.S. dollars, debt levels rose dramatically in Global South nations, and they were unable to pay the debts. Now, normally they chose to default on the debts, which should be their right under any free market system. But the U.S. refused to allow them to default on the debts because that would have basically toppled Wall Street banks, which were massively overexposed to these toxic debts. So the IMF was used by the U.S. to step in and solve the debt crisis by forcing Global South nations to repay these unpayable debts by, again, privatizing their public assets, cutting social spending, literally taking money out of the mouths of poor people, out of the pockets of workers, and sending it to over-indebted banks in the U.S. So it was really less a way of creating a debt crisis as a sort of a way of solving a debt crisis that was discriminatory against the majority of the world's poor people in favor of U.S. banks. That's kind of how it worked. And of course, this worked out to be incredibly in the interest of the U.S. because it allowed them to regain access to Global South markets, to use their cheap labor and raw materials and so on. So for them, it was a huge benefit, but it created massive amounts of new poverty in the Global South in the 80s and 90s.
You write that viewing global inequality as a technical problem that can be fixed by international institutions like the IMF maintains an industry worth billions of dollars and an army of NGOs, charities, and foundations seeking to end poverty through aid and charity. It has become an enormous industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, as much as all the profits of all the banks in the United States combined. Will there be global inequality, even growing global inequality and global poverty, as long as there's money to be made in pushing the idea that technical fixes can end global poverty?
Yeah. It's interesting. So the way the development industry works right now is they kind of assume that we can solve these problems by just tweaking, a few policies here and there in the way the global economy works. But they're mostly focused on policy problems in poor nations. Okay, so the idea is that poor nations are primarily responsible for their own failures here, and so we need to go in there and sort of fix their corruption, get them to adopt the right policies, and we can do this with a little bit of aid here and there, right? Now, the problem here is that this approach completely ignores the way that the global economy actually works. So, if we look at the aid disbursements that rich nations give to poor nations every year, again, about $130 billion each year, which is an enormous amount of money. In reality, this flow of aid is actually vastly outstripped by money that flows in the opposite direction, in the form of illicit financial flows, tax evasion by multinational companies, effectively taking profits out of developing countries where they operate and stashing them in tax havens, mostly controlled by Western countries like the UK and the US. Interest payments on debts are a huge part of this as well, repatriated profits, and so on and so forth. So we know that, according to recent research, which is very illuminating on this, more money flows from poor nations to rich nations every year than the other way around. So the global South is a net creditor to the global North, which is really kind of a mind-blowing fact that reverses the way that we think about how the development industry actually works. So for every dollar of aid that the South receives, they actually lose $24 in net outflows. So what we need to do is we need to stop thinking of aid as a solution Effectively aid, what it does is it makes the takers in the system, which are rich countries, appear like givers and gives them a kind of moral high ground. And this obscures from us the way the global economic system actually works and prevents us from recognizing what we can actually do to solve the problem of global inequality. So when you take a more structural view, think about how the system is designed, whose interest it serves, who has power in the system and who doesn't, and those are the kinds of interventions we need to make.
Has development either become, or was it originally intended to be, just another form of colonial or imperial power? You mentioned how the whole idea of development started in the 1949 inaugural speech by President Harry Truman. That's right after the war ends, right after colonialism seemingly is collapsing around the world. So how much was development originally intended to, or was it turned into just another form of colonial or imperial power?
Yeah, so this is an important story, I think, and one that to me is quite important in the divide. So it's crucial to understand that so of course colonialism was an economic disaster for the global South. Okay, but then after colonialism, after European powers withdrew from the shores of the global South colonies, and after the U.S. adopted under Franklin Roosevelt the Good Neighbor policy, which effectively withdrew their control from Latin America. So in the wake of this withdrawal, then newly independent global South nations began using progressive economic policies, mostly Keynesian, basically economic policies, to kind of rebuild their economies, and they did so with remarkable success. Okay, so again, making excellent use of tariffs and infant industry subsidies and social spending and nationalization, and land reform, wage reform, et cetera, et cetera. They were doing really well. They were making strides against poverty, and for the first time in history, they were closing the gap between rich nations and poor nations. Now, you would think that the West would be excited about this because the West, of course, claims to be pro-development, but in fact, they were deeply disturbed because what this pattern basically meant is that they were losing their access to global South markets and to cheap raw materials and cheap labor, which they had previously enjoyed under colonialism. Okay, so they had to find some way of restoring that access. And the way they did it initially was violently. Okay, and this is a history that most people have forgotten. But the U.S. And the UK and France and a few other former European colonial powers were heavily invested in trying to topple progressive political regimes across the global South, which they did through the 50s and 60s and 70s in at least a dozen or more cases. Probably the most famous of these is the assassination of Salvador Allende, the progressive, democratically elected president of Chile in 1973. But it began under Eisenhower in 1953 with the coup against Iran's democratically elected leader. Because Iran had nationalized their oil reserves, which had previously been controlled by BP, by Britain, this is why Britain reacted against Iran. They called on the U.S. for support. The same pattern was played out over and over and over again, where progressive regimes fundamentally acted against the economic interests of former colonial powers or the U.S. and were either deposed or assassinated for their policies. And quite often, in their place, were installed dictatorships that promised effectively to re-liberalize the economy, to re-allow Western corporations back in to effectively do what they wanted to. So this is kind of the pattern that played out through the 60s and 70s. But it really wasn't until the 1980s that, with the imposition of structural adjustment, in one fell swoop, the U.S. and Western Europe were able to reverse all of the progressive economic policies that the global South had so painstakingly enacted in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So yeah, there's no question that, and crucially, right, structural adjustments and subsequent policies in the South have been brought in under the banner of development, despite the fact that the opposite has actually occurred. And so it's very clear that with these kinds of interventions, the idea behind development, at least as led by the World Bank and IMF, has crucially been designed in order to restore economic hegemony to Western economies, and it's been very successful at doing that.